There is a particular kind of hunger that arrives in the hour after you have failed. Not the hunger of the body. The body has nothing to do with it. Though the body will be conscripted shortly, no, this is a hunger that lives somewhere behind the sternum, a little above where the breath would settle. If the breath were allowed to settle, it is sharp, but not painful in the way a wound is painful. It is more like the sharpness of a key turning in a lock you did not know was there. And the moment the key turns, you are no longer in the room, you are in another room entirely. And in that room, there is something waiting for you, a substance, a screen, a body, a bottle, a phrase repeated under the breath, a refrigerator door, a familiar number to dial, a website you swore you would never open again. You did not choose to walk into this room, you were delivered to it. And the part of you that watches all of this from a small high window in the back of the mind, that part has long since stopped being surprised. You know this hour. You have lived inside it for years, perhaps decades. The shape of the failure changes. Sometimes it is small, a misspoken sentence in a meeting, a glance from a stranger that landed wrong, a piece of work returned with corrections, a phone call that went silent in a way you could not interpret. Sometimes it is larger, a relationship that did not survive the question you finally asked, a project that collapsed under its own weight, a hope that quietly went out like a candle in a corridor. But the size of the failure is not what determines what happens next. What determines what happens next is something older, something that was decided in you long before you knew there was anything to decide. And the moment the failure registers, the moment the verdict arrives that you were not, in that instance, what you needed to be, the old machinery begins to move. The key turns, the room opens, you walk in. I want to describe this carefully, because the description is the beginning of the work. The compulsion does not feel like a decision. This is the first thing to understand. It does not arrive with the texture of choice. It arrives with the texture of inevitability, as though the path between the failure and the consolation has been worn so smooth by repetition that there is no longer any friction in it, no longer any place where you might catch your foot and stop. The body moves before the mind has finished registering what the body is doing. The hand is already reaching, the browser is already open, the bottle is already in the hand. And then, and this is the cruelest part, there is a brief moment, perhaps a half second, perhaps less, in which something in you watches the reaching and says nothing, not because it agrees, but because it has been overruled so many times that it has stopped speaking. You have likely been told by yourself and by others that this is a problem of willpower, that if you were stronger, more disciplined, more present, more healed, the compulsion would not have such a grip on you. I want to say plainly and at the outset that this explanation is not only incomplete, it is the very thing that keeps you trapped. The story you have been telling yourself about your compulsions is the story your compulsions require you to keep telling. Because as long as you believe the question is whether you are strong enough, you will never ask the question that would actually free you, which is, what is the compulsion doing, not what is it costing you. Not what is it taking from you, but what is it doing? What work, what office, what ancient appointed task is it carrying out in the architecture of your psyche? Again and again, every time you fail, I have come to think that compulsions are not pathologies in the way we have been taught to understand them. They are not malfunctions. They are not the sign that something has broken in you. They are, on the contrary, evidence that something in you is working with extraordinary fidelity, a fidelity so deep and so old that you cannot remember a time before it. The compulsion is doing exactly what it was built to do in exactly the moment it was built to do it. The trouble is only this: what it was built to do, you no longer need. The room it was designed to take you to was a room that once was a refuge, and now it is a cage. But the part of you that built the room cannot tell the difference, because the part of you that built the room has not been told that the years have passed. Let me say something here that may sound strange to you. The compulsion that arrives after failure is, in its origin, an act of love. I know how that sentence sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of thing one says to make a person feel better about something they want to feel worse about. That is not what I mean. I mean it in the most precise sense I can manage. The mechanism that delivers you every time into the consoling room after failure was constructed by a child, a younger version of you who had no other way to survive. What failure meant in the house where you grew up, the mechanism was built with great care and great urgency by someone who had no other tools, and it was built well, so well that it has outlasted the house, so well that it now operates in rooms where it is no longer needed, in the presence of failures that are not, in fact, the kind of failure it was designed to protect you from. And every time it operates, it is still, though you cannot feel this and would not believe it. If I told you still trying to save your life, you may have already begun to resist this. Good. Stay with the resistance. I am not asking you to feel grateful for the compulsion. I am asking you to consider the possibility that what you have been calling weakness is, in fact, the residue of an old strength, a strength that was deployed in conditions you cannot remember clearly, against a threat that no longer exists in the form it once took, by an intelligence in you that was, at the time, doing the best work it knew how to do. The hand that reaches for the consolation is not the hand of a person who has failed at being human. It is the hand of a person who once learned, in some room you have largely forgotten, that failure was unsafe. That failure had to be erased, smoothed over, sealed away, before anyone could see it. That the gap between who you were supposed to be and who you actually were could not be allowed to remain open, because what came through that gap in the household of your origin was something you could not survive. What came through the gap? I want you to hold that phrase, because it is the beginning of the thesis I am going to develop with you over the next several hours of our conversation. The thesis is this: the compulsion is not the wound. The compulsion is the door you built over the wound. And the door has been doing its work so faithfully for so long that you have come to believe the door is the wound. You have come to believe that if you could just stop using the door, the trouble would be over, but the door is not the trouble. The door is what was constructed in response to the trouble. The trouble is on the other side, and the only way the trouble ever comes to rest is when someone you, slowly, over time, with help and with patience and with a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with willpower, finally opens the door from this side and looks at what is behind it. Not to remove it, not to fix it, only to see it, only to recognize it, only to give it, at last, the witness it has been waiting for since, before you knew there was anything to witness. You will not do this today. I am not going to ask you to. What I am going to ask you in these hours we have together is something much smaller and much more difficult. I am going to ask you to suspend, for as long as you can manage, the story that the compulsion is your enemy, not because the compulsion is your friend. It is not. It is not a friend. It is something older and stranger than friendship or enmity. It is a function that was once necessary and is no longer, but that has not yet been informed that its necessity has expired. And as long as you go to war with it, as long as you treat it as a problem to be defeated rather than a structure to be understood, you will lose. You will lose because you cannot defeat something whose purpose you do not yet know. And you will lose, more importantly, because the war itself feeds the structure. Every time you fail to defeat the compulsion has fresh evidence that you cannot be trusted with the original wound. And so the door grows thicker, and the consolation grows more elaborate, and the hour after failure grows longer and stranger and more inevitable. I want to return, before this first hour closes, to the image I began with, the key turning in the lock you did not know was there. I want you to consider that the key was not given to you by an enemy. The key was given to you by a child who had a key made in great secrecy, because the child understood without being able to put words to the understanding that there would be times when the only way to survive what failure meant in your house would be to leave the room of your own awareness and go into another room. The child made the key with such craftsmanship that the key still works, decades later, in conditions the child never imagined. And every time you fail, the child hands you the key. The child does not know that you no longer need the key. The child does not know that the house has changed, that you have grown, that the failures you face now are not the failures the child was protecting you from. The child is still at the post, still loyal, still working, and the work that lies before you, though we are nowhere near it yet, is not to take the key from the child. It is to find the child, to go into the room the child has been standing in for 40 years, or 50, or 60, and to sit down on the floor near the child and to begin very slowly to tell the child what year it is. You will have noticed, I expect, that the language we use for compulsions in our age is almost entirely the language of war. We speak of fighting addictions, of battling urges, of being on the wagon and falling off it, of relapse and recovery as though they were the movements of an army. We speak of triggers as though the psyche were a weapon to be discharged. We speak of being clean as though what we did the night before had made us dirty. And underneath all of this language, like the bass note, one hears only after the room has gone quiet, is a single assumption that the compulsion is an external invader, a foreign body, an intruder in the otherwise clean house of the self, and that the work consists of expelling it. The work is to identify it, name it, surround it, isolate it, and drive it out. I want to say something now that I have said in many rooms to many people over many years, and that I have rarely been believed the first time I said it, so I will say it slowly. The compulsion is not an intruder. It was not imposed on you from outside. It is not a parasite that has attached itself to an otherwise whole psyche. The compulsion is, and here I must ask you to read the next phrase twice, because the words will slide past too quickly if you do not. The compulsion is something the psyche made, on purpose, with intelligence, for a reason. It is not something that happened to you. It is something you authored, not consciously, not with what you would now call your will, but authored nonetheless by a deeper writer in you who was working under conditions you can scarcely imagine, and who was in the conditions of that authorship. Brilliant. I know this is hard to receive. The diagnostic frameworks that surround us, and they are everywhere now, more pervasive in our time than they have ever been in human history, encourage us to think of our suffering as a thing that has gone wrong with the machinery, the depression as a chemical imbalance, the anxiety as an overactive nervous system, the compulsion as a dysregulated reward pathway. And there is truth in these descriptions of a kind. The biology is real. The neurochemistry does what the neurochemistry does, but the diagnostic name treats the symptom as if it began in the body, as if it began in the brain, as if it began in the machinery. The symptom did not begin in the machinery. The symptom began in the situation. The machinery learned to do what the machinery does because of a situation, and until the situation is understood, the machinery cannot be addressed. You can quiet it for a time, with medicine, with discipline, with the various forms of management our civilization has perfected, but you cannot resolve it, because what wants resolution is not in the machinery. What wants resolution is in the situation the machinery was responding to. So I will ask you to consider, for the duration of this hour, a different framework altogether, not the framework of malfunction, the framework of message. The compulsion is not a thing that has gone wrong in you. The compulsion is a message from a part of yourself that has not found another way to speak. And like all messages from the parts of us that have been forced into silence for a very long time, the message arrives in code, it arrives in symbol, it arrives in behavior that, viewed from the outside, looks self-destructive and viewed from the inside looks like the only available means of communication between two parts of a self that have lost the ability to talk to each other directly. You and the part of you that runs to the compulsion are not enemies. You are two halves of a single being who have stopped speaking. And the compulsion is the only language in which the silent half still knows how to address you. I once worked with a man who came to me in his late 40s, a man of considerable accomplishment, who had a habit he could not break of drinking himself into unconsciousness on the nights following any professional setback. He had tried everything. He had tried the methods of his time, which were not many, and he had tried his own methods, which were considerable. Because he was a disciplined man, nothing worked. He came to me not because he believed I could help him, but because he had run out of people who claimed they could. And in our work together, what we discovered, and I say we because this is not work one does for another person, one can only do it with them. What we discovered was that the drinking was not, in any meaningful sense, about the failure. The drinking was about what the failure had touched, and what the failure had touched was something much older. A scene, repeating, that had its origin in a childhood evening in which a father had said certain words to a small boy, and the small boy had decided in that evening that he would never let himself be seen failing again. The drinking was not the boy breaking his promise. The drinking was the boy keeping his promise. He could not let himself be seen failing, not even by himself. And so, when failure arrived, the drinking arrived to ensure that no one, including the man himself, was awake to witness it. I tell you this not because your story is his story. Your story is your own, but the structure may be familiar. The compulsion is almost always, I would say always, but I have come to be cautious with that word in my old age. The compulsion is almost always doing work that has nothing to do with the substance or the behavior itself. The drinking is not about the drinking. The eating is not about the eating. The scrolling is not about the screen. The body the stranger meets is not about the stranger. The compulsion is about a function, and the function, in nearly every case I have known, is to manage a feeling that someone, somewhere in your past, made unbearable to feel. Failure is not the problem. Failure is the doorbell. What rings when failure rings is what you cannot bear to answer. And here I want to come to the first of the deeper distinctions I will be asking you to hold. There is a difference, and I want you to feel this difference in your body. Not only consider it in your mind. There is a difference between failure as event and failure as verdict. Failure as event is what happens in the world. A project does not work. A relationship ends. A piece of work is not received well. A choice turns out to have been the wrong choice. These are events. They are difficult, sometimes painful, sometimes devastating, but they are events. They occur in time. They have consequences in time. They can be addressed in time. Failure as verdict is something else entirely. Failure as verdict is the moment in which the failed event becomes a statement about who you are. The project did not work, and therefore you are not the kind of person whose projects work. the relationship ended, and therefore you are not the kind of person who is loved. The choice was wrong, and therefore you are not the kind of person who can be trusted to choose. Most people who suffer from compulsions are not running from failure as event. They are running from failure as verdict. They are running from the moment in which what happened becomes what they are. And the reason this moment is unbearable, the reason it is so unbearable that the psyche must immediately invent a corridor out of it, is that somewhere far back in the formation of the self, you now are. This moment was made to mean something it cannot have meant. The moment of failure was made to mean that you were not lovable, that you would be left, that you would be punished, that you would be looked at with the look you could not survive being looked at with. The moment of failure became the moment of exile, and you decided at some point that you would never go into that exile again by any means necessary. The means necessary, it turns out, are the compulsions. The compulsions are the corridor out of the moment of verdict. They do not address the event. They are not designed to. They are designed only to deliver you out of the moment in which the event is about to become a verdict, out of that moment and into another moment. Any other moment in which the verdict cannot be pronounced. The wine works because while one is drinking the wine, no verdict can be pronounced. The screen works because while one is in the screen, no verdict can be pronounced. The body of the stranger works because while one is in that body, no verdict can be pronounced. The food works because while one is eating, no verdict can be pronounced. The compulsion is, in its essence, a verdict postponement device. It does not change what happened. It only changes the room you are in when what happened tries to become what you are. I said earlier, in our first hour, that the door was built by a child. I want now to be more precise about what the child was building, because the imprecision will cost us if we do not correct it. The child was not building a door away from pain. Pain in itself is not what the child could not bear. Children are capable of considerable pain, and they survive considerable pain when the pain is met by a witness who can hold it. What the child could not bear was pain that arrived without a witness, pain that arrived in the absence of someone who could see the pain and say, "This is real, this is yours, and you are not wrong to feel it." In the absence of such a witness, pain becomes something else. It becomes a kind of evidence, evidence against the self, evidence that something about the self is wrong. Because if something were not wrong, surely someone would have come. The witness who did not come becomes, in the child's logic, a witness who did not come because there was nothing worth coming for. And then the pain is no longer just pain. The pain is the proof that one is not worth witnessing. This is the thing I want you to understand about the hour after failure. It is not a failure that you cannot bear. It is the prospect of standing in front of the failure alone, the prospect of being inside the verdict without anyone there to dispute it, to soften it, to receive it, to say, "I see you." This is hard. You are not what this moment says you are, and because you learned very early, that no such witness would arrive, because you learned this so thoroughly that you no longer remember learning it. The compulsion arrives instead. The compulsion arrives in the place where the witness was supposed to stand, the bottle in the place where the mother was supposed to be, the screen in the place where the father was supposed to look, the body of the stranger in the place where the sibling was supposed to know. The compulsion is not the absence of love. The compulsion is what stands in for love when love did not arrive in the form it was supposed to arrive in. And it stands in so faithfully, so reliably, so absolutely, without fail, that you have come to depend on it the way one depends on the only friend who has never, in 50 years, missed a single appointment. This is the mistranslation I want to break, not the mistranslation that says the compulsion is bad. You know that the compulsion is bad. You have known it for years. The mistranslation I want to break is the one that says the compulsion is empty, that it is nothing, that it is only a habit, only a chemistry, only a weakness. The compulsion is not empty. The compulsion is full. It is full of the missing witness. It is full of the unrendered care. It is full of the love that did not arrive at the address it was supposed to arrive at, and that had to be improvised by you, alone, in a child's room, with what materials you could find. The materials you could find were the materials that have become your compulsions, and the love that was missing, the love that has been missing all along, is what you have been mistaking all this time for an enemy. In a book I wrote a long while ago on the relations between what we call the ego and what lies beneath it, I tried to set down something I had observed in many people who came to me, that what we do not bring into awareness returns to us, not as a thought, not as an idea, but as an event, as a fate. The compulsion, you see, is exactly this. It is the unbrought into awareness returning as fate. It returns at the appointed hour. It cannot be argued with. It cannot be reasoned out of arriving, and it will keep returning in one form or another, no matter how many forms you strip from it, until what it carries is finally seen. There is a structure I want to draw for you now, slowly, and I want you to hold it in your mind, not as a diagram, but as the floor plan of a house you have been living in without ever having seen its drawings. The house is the house of your psyche, and it has rooms in it that were arranged long before you were old enough to arrange anything. The rooms were arranged, in fact, by people who were themselves arranging rooms that had been arranged for them by their parents and by the parents of their parents, going back further than any of you could remember. What I am about to describe is not yours alone. It is yours. Certainly, it is happening in you, but it did not begin in you. And this is one of the most important things you will ever come to understand about your suffering, that the beginning of it was not your beginning. You inherited rooms, and in those rooms, the furniture was already arranged in a particular way before you walked in. The room I want to take you into now is the one where failure was first made into verdict. Every person who suffers from compulsions has such a room. It does not look the same in any two houses. In some houses, the room is a kitchen. In some houses, it is a bedroom. In some houses, it is a car, or a stretch of road, or a particular hour of a particular evening that arrived again and again. The geography is not what matters. What matters is what happened in that room, and what happened in that room is that at some moment, perhaps over and over, you brought something to the people who were supposed to receive you, and what you brought was not received: a drawing, a grade, a feeling, a request, a wound, a small failing that in another household would have been met with a hand on the shoulder, a few words, a presence. In your household, and I am using you loosely, I am speaking of the household that anyone who suffers from compulsions in adulthood remembers what you brought was met instead with something cold: a withdrawal, a silence, a face that turned away, a voice that became a knife, a presence that became absence, and in the place where the warmth should have been, something else moved in, something dark, something disapproving, something that took the small event of your imperfection and made it the central fact of who you were in that household. For that hour, perhaps for that evening, perhaps for longer, I have known many people who organized their entire adult lives around the avoidance of this hour. The hour after the small failure, when the household became cold, they built whole careers around it. They chose partners according to it. They drank, or ate, or scrolled, or worked, or thought, in exactly the patterns required to keep that hour from ever returning. And the great irony of these lives, and I want you to feel the irony, because the irony is part of what eventually frees a person. The great irony is that the very means by which they sought to avoid that hour were the means by which they guaranteed it would return again and again, in different clothes, for the rest of their lives. The compulsion does not protect you from the room. The compulsion is the room refurnished with different wallpaper in a different city, with you as the only inhabitant. Let me say it more directly. When you run to the compulsion after failure, you are not escaping the original room, you are re-entering it. The compulsion does not take you out of the moment of verdict. The compulsion takes you every time back to the moment of verdict, but with one small, terrible difference. In the original room, the verdict was pronounced by someone else. In the compulsion's room, the verdict is pronounced by you. You become, in the act of the compulsion, both the child who failed and the parent who withdrew. You enact on yourself the very abandonment that you were trying to avoid. The drinking is not a comfort. The drinking is a reenactment. The eating past fullness is not a soothing. It is a punishment administered by you in exactly the spirit in which it was once administered to you. The screen, the body, the substance, these are not consolations. They are the original cold room, recreated in faithful detail, with you now in the role of the one who turns away, and the part of you that runs to the compulsion is not, as you have thought, the wounded child, The part of you that runs to the compulsion is the parent who withdrew. The compulsion is the moment in which you take up against yourself the very weapon that was once turned against you. I want you to stay with this, because the resistance to it will be considerable. You have likely been told, in whatever therapeutic frame you have moved through, that you go to the compulsion to comfort the wounded child in you. This is half true. The wounded child is involved, but the wounded child is not the one driving. The wounded child is the one in the back seat. The one driving is the figure who learned in the original household that when a child fails, the proper response is to withdraw, to punish, to absent oneself, to deliver the cold. That figure is in you. It was installed in you by repetition, by exposure, by survival. And when you fail now, that figure activates exactly as it was trained to activate. It punishes, it withdraws, it absents you from yourself, and the means by which it does this, its hands, its instruments are the compulsions. The compulsion is the cold parent, working through your own body on the same child who once received the cold. The architecture is preserved, the roles are preserved, only the actors have changed. You are now against yourself, all of them at once. This is what I mean when I say the compulsion was authored by an intelligence in you. The authoring intelligence was not a wise intelligence. It was not a benevolent intelligence. It was a survival intelligence working with the materials at hand, and the only materials at hand when a child must survive a cold household are the materials of the cold household itself. The child has no other materials. The child has only what is in the room. And what is in the room is the parent. So the child takes the parent inside. The child internalizes the cold parent, not because the child wants the cold parent inside, but because the child cannot survive the cold parent outside without having some version of it inside, where at least it can be predicted, controlled, anticipated. The internal cold parent is, in some terrible way, easier to live with than the external cold parent, because at least the internal one is yours. You can run it, you can know when it will arrive, you can call it in yourself before it arrives uninvited. And this is the deepest mechanism I want to put before you in this hour. This is what the compulsion is. The compulsion is your way of administering to yourself the cold parent's withdrawal at a time of your own choosing, so that you no longer have to wait for it to arrive from outside. You no longer have to wait. That is the key. The thing the compulsion gives you that nothing else gives you is mastery over the timing of the abandonment. In the original household, the abandonment came when the parent decided the child had no say in it. The child could only wait for it, dread it, brace for it. The child lived under the constant possibility of it, and there is no condition more intolerable to a small human being than the condition of waiting indefinitely for an abandonment one cannot prevent. So the small human being, in their brilliance, in their desperation, in the only move available to them, takes the timing into their own hands. The small human being decides, I will abandon myself first. I will deliver the cold to myself before anyone else can deliver it. I will fail in my own eyes before anyone else can fail me in theirs. And in doing so, I will, at last, have some control over the one event in my life that has been most uncontrollable. The compulsion is mastery. This is the contrarian thing I want you to hold. The compulsion is not a loss of mastery, it is, perversely, a form of it. It is the only form of mastery the child could obtain over the one situation the child could not otherwise master, and it has continued into your adulthood to be experienced by the deeper layers of you as a form of mastery, even though on the surface it looks like complete loss of control. This is why willpower does not work against it. You cannot overpower with willpower something that the psyche is currently experiencing as the highest exercise of power available to it. You cannot defeat with strength the very mechanism by which a desperate part of you first learned what strength was, and every attempt to defeat it strengthens it, because every attempt confirms to the part of you that runs the compulsion that the compulsion is the only place where you have any agency at all. What we did not bring into consciousness, I once wrote, returns to us as fate. The fate is the compulsion. The unbrought into consciousness is the room, the cold parent, the moment of withdrawal, the verdict pronounced against the small self. These are what remain unconscious, and they return as fate in the form of the compulsion again and again, every time failure arrives, until they are brought into consciousness. The fate will continue. No discipline will end it. No medicine will end it. No technique will end it. Only the slow, difficult, often boring work of bringing the room into the light, of allowing yourself to remember what the room was, who was in it, what was said, what was felt, what the small self decided in response. Only this work eventually allows the fate to soften. And even then, the softening is not a removal. The room does not disappear. The room becomes, instead, a room you can stand in without being destroyed. A room you can enter and leave at will. A room that no longer requires the compulsion as its only door. And here's something I want to add, because the picture would not be complete without it. What I have just described, the cold parent, the internalized withdrawal, the failure, as verdict, this is rarely confined to a single generation, almost never. The cold parent who delivered the verdict to you was, in nearly every case I have known, a person who had received the same verdict in some earlier household from their own parent, and that parent had received it from theirs. The compulsion you now suffer from is, in this sense, not your invention. It is the inherited end of a long, often invisible chain of withdrawals, each one passed down because no one in the chain had the resources or the time or the witness to break it. You did not begin the chain. You are simply the one in whom it has, finally, become loud enough to hear, the compulsion in you is, in a strange way, the ancestors knocking at the door of consciousness, asking, through your suffering, to finally be looked at, because they could not look at themselves, and so the looking has fallen to you, which is, I will say, in passing, why the work you do on this in your own life is never only for you. The work always goes both directions in time, behind you, into those who could not do it, and ahead of you, into those who will not have to. I knew a man who, for years, returned to the same dream after every important failure. In the dream, he was walking down a long corridor in a house he half recognized. The corridor ended at a door. Behind the door, he knew, was a small room with someone in it, but he could never see who, because every time he reached for the handle, he woke up. He came to me wanting to know who was behind the door. I told him I did not know. No analyst can know in advance who is behind the door in another person's dream. What I told him was that the door would not open until he was prepared to discover that what was behind it was not what he expected. Not a monster, not a ghost, not even, in the end, apparent. What was behind the door was a child, his own child self, sitting on the floor of a room that had grown cold, waiting for someone to come back. The child had been waiting in that room for 50 years. The compulsion he had been running to all his adult life was, though he had not known this, his way of walking past the door of that room every time, hearing the child crying behind it, and continuing on as he had been taught to continue on. The dream was the part of him that knew the child was there. The compulsion was the part of him that knew and walked past anyway, because walking past was what had been modeled in his house by people who had themselves walked past the children they once were. I tell you this because I want you to recognize that what we are describing is not, in the end, a mystery. It is intimate, it is precise, it is in you, and it has a shape, and the shape can be known. The compulsion has a room, the room has a door, behind the door is a child. The child is yours, and the work, the only work that ever finally addresses the compulsion at its root, is the work of going back into the corridor, opening the door and sitting down on the floor with the child who has been there all along. I want to be careful with what I say in this last hour, because the temptation, when one has traced a long arc of suffering back to its origin, is to conclude with instructions, to say here is what you should now do, here is the practice, here is the technique. And I have come to think, in the years I have had to consider these matters, that instructions at this point in a piece of work are almost always a betrayal of the work. They turn what was an opening into a task. They turn what was a recognition into a project, and the part of you that runs to compulsions, let us not forget, is the part of you that has been turning recognitions into projects your whole life. That part is excellent at projects. Give it a project, and it will use the project itself as the next compulsion. Give it a practice, and it will weaponize the practice. Give it an instruction, and within a week it will be failing at the instruction, and the failure at the instruction will become a new occasion for the old corridor. So I will not give you instructions. What I will give you instead is a description of what changes when the structure I have been describing begins to be seen. Because something does change, not all at once, not in a way you can measure on any given day, not in a way that makes the compulsion disappear like a bad dream upon waking, but something changes gradually in the way one experiences the hour after failure, and it is this change I want to put before you now, so that when it begins to happen, and if you continue to work on what we have looked at together, it will begin to happen. You will recognize it and not mistake it for something else. The first thing that changes is the speed. For years, perhaps decades, the corridor between the failure and the compulsion has been so smooth that there was no gap in it at all. The verdict arrived, and the compulsion arrived in the same motion, the same breath, the same gesture. There was no daylight between them. They were a single event. What begins to happen as the room behind the door comes into a little more light is that a small gap opens up between the failure and the running. At first the gap is tiny, a half second, a second, a breath in which you notice with something like surprise that you are about to run, and then you run anyway. But the noticing has happened, and the noticing, even when it does not yet change the running, has begun to change something deeper. The noticing is the beginning of the witness that was missing all along. I want to dwell on this. The witness that was missing in the original room, the parent who could not see the child's failure as anything but the child's failure, who could not hold the failure as a moment in time rather than a verdict on the soul, that witness, you see, is now becoming available, not from outside. The original witness will never arrive from outside, no matter how long you wait, no matter how many people you bring close to you. The original parent will not become, in retrospect, the parent who could meet you. The household that was cold will not, in your memory, warm itself. These are facts. They cannot be changed. What can be changed is the inner constellation. The witness who was missing in the outer room can grow inside you slowly, with patience, with many returns to the corridor. The witness grows, and the witness is you, but it is the part of you that has begun, finally, to stand on the side of the child rather than on the side of the cold parent. This is the great inner reversal. For years, your interior life has been organized around the cold parent's perspective. The cold parent's voice has been the loudest voice in you. The cold parent's verdicts have been the verdicts that mattered. What begins to happen when the work proceeds is that another voice grows, quieter at first, less practiced, but present, and this voice is on the side of the small self, not in opposition to the cold parent. Opposition would only feed the war, but on the side of the small self, standing where the witness was supposed to stand. all those years ago and never did. When this inner witness grows strong enough, something curious happens to the compulsion. It does not become a thing you defeat. It becomes a thing you can be with. You begin to notice in the hour after failure that the urge to run has arrived and that you can sit for a little while in the presence of the urge without yet acting on it. You can feel what is underneath the urge, the verdict trying to be pronounced, the cold trying to descend, the child in the room, and the inner witness who has been growing in you can say to the child, not in words, because this is not work that happens in words, can say, I see you. The failure happened. The failure is real, and it is not what you are. I am here. I am not going anywhere. We can stay in this room together for as long as it takes. This is what was missing. This, and only this, is what the compulsion has been substituting for all these years. The compulsion was a substitute witness, a poor one, a destructive one, but the only one available. When a real witness begins to grow inside you, the compulsion's office is slowly taken from it, not because you fight the compulsion, not because you defeat it, but because something else has stepped into the role the compulsion was filling, and the compulsion is, at last, no longer required. The compulsion's loyalty, which has been so total and so exhausting for so long, can begin to relax. The sentry who has been standing at the post for 50 years can begin, at last, to be relieved. I want to put before you here a verified quote, words I once set down and have not yet found a way to say more accurately, that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. I have repeated this in various forms throughout our hours together, because it is the single sentence that contains the entire teaching. The compulsion is fate. As long as the room behind the door remains unconscious, the compulsion is what the unconscious does with the materials of your adult life to enact what cannot yet be remembered, make the room conscious, and the fate softens, not into nothing, into something that can be born, into something that is finally yours rather than your master. There's something else I want to say in this last hour, and it concerns what to do, and here I will permit myself one small word about doing what to do in the actual moment when the compulsion arrives. Not as instruction, as description, when the urge comes after failure, in its familiar shape, in its old hour, there is a small movement available to you that has perhaps not been available before. You can ask, before running, who is currently running, not to stop the running. The running may continue. You may not yet be strong enough to interrupt it. And there is no shame in this. The shame, in fact, is one of the things we have been working to set down, but you can ask, who is this in me right now, who is about to go through the door? You will discover, if you ask the question slowly enough, that it is not a wounded child running. The wounded child does not have the strength to run. The wounded child is the one being left behind in the room when the running happens. The one who runs is the older figure, the inherited one, the cold one, the one who learned in another household, in another century perhaps, that this is what one does when failure arrives. And there is a great freedom in seeing that you are not, in this moment, a single self. You are an inherited drama with several characters in it, and the running is one character's part. You can decline to play the part, not always, not yet, perhaps, but sometimes, and the sometimes, as the years pass, can grow. I knew a woman who came to me many years ago, and I will not say more about her circumstances, because the details belong to her, who came after a long history of behaviors she could no longer afford. She had tried, by her own account, everything. We worked for a long time, and the work was slow, and there were many returns to the corridor. What changed her in the end was not a technique, it was not a discipline, it was a single recognition that arrived for her on a particular afternoon. Sitting in the room we worked in, looking at nothing in particular, she said to me slowly, as though she were just then understanding what she was saying, I have been running all my life from a person who is not chasing me anymore. The person who was once chasing her, the original cold figure in her own household, had been dead for many years. The chase had ended in the outer world long ago, but the chase had continued in her faithfully. Every time anything in her life resembled the conditions of the original failure, and what she recognized that afternoon was that the chase was over. There was no longer anyone to outrun. The running could stop, not because she had defeated the running, but because she had finally noticed that nothing was, at that moment, requiring her to run. I tell you this because I want you to hold the possibility that what you are running from when you run to your compulsions may not be present in the room you are actually in. It is present in another room, the original one, the one from long ago, the one with the cold parent and the small self and the verdict in the air. It is present there with absolute reality, but it is not present here, in this hour, in this body, in this life. The room is different. The people who once delivered the cold are not in this room, delivering the cold. Some of them are gone, some have changed. Some were never as terrible as they have lived in your interior, since the room you are running from is not the room you are currently in. And the recognition of this, when it finally lands, not as an idea, but as a felt truth, changes everything about what the hour after failure means. I want to come back, in closing, to the image with which we began, the hand reaching, the door opening, the corridor we did not choose to walk down, the room we were delivered to, and I want to say something I have been moving toward for our entire conversation. The compulsion was never the enemy. I know this is hard to hear after a lifetime of suffering. The compulsion has cost you a great deal. It has cost you years, relationships, health, time, money, peace. None of this is to be minimized, but the compulsion itself was not the source of the cost. The compulsion was the bill presented again and again for an original transaction that was never named. The original transaction was the moment in which you, as a small person, took the cold parent inside in order to survive the cold parent outside. The bill for that transaction has been arriving at your door for as long as you can remember. The compulsion is the bill. The original transaction is what wants at last to be looked at. And when you look at it, and you will, in your own time, in your own way, with whatever help you find, in whatever rooms turn out to be the right rooms for this work, when you look at it, what you will find is not what you have feared finding. You have feared finding behind the door some unbearable scene that will destroy you. The scene is not behind the door. The scene happened. It is over. What is behind the door is the small self who lived through it, who is still living through it, who has been waiting in that room for someone to come back. The someone, it turns out, was always going to be you, not the child, the adult who could not at the time exist because no adult existed in the room. And so no adult could be witnessed and learned from. The adults had to grow afterward on the outside, in the world, slowly, often badly, often through the wreckage that the compulsion left behind. The adult is growing still, and the adult, when grown enough, finally walks back down the corridor, opens the door, and sits down on the floor with the child. This is the work. This is what lies underneath the compulsions you have suffered from. The compulsions are not the trouble. The compulsions are the long, faithful, exhausting way the psyche has of pointing again and again at the room that wants to be entered. They have been pointing for years. They will keep pointing for as long as you need them to. And when, at last, you walk down the corridor on your own, when you do what the compulsion was trying in its rough and costly way to do for you, the compulsion will not have to do it anymore. It will be relieved of its post. It will not vanish overnight. It may visit in lighter forms for a long time, but its grip will loosen, because what it was trying to deliver you toward, you will at last be delivering yourself toward. Without it, the hand that reached all those years was reaching for something. It was not reaching for the substance. It was not reaching for the screen. It was not reaching for the body or the bottle or the door of the consoling room. It was reaching all along for the witness who was never in the original room. And the witness is you, the you who has lived long enough, suffered enough, walked the corridor enough times to know now what was always at the end of it. Not a monster, not a verdict, not a punishment, a small self sitting on the floor who has been waiting for the only person who could ever finally arrive, and the person at last is arriving late by many decades, but arriving, and the small self looks up, and the room begins very slowly to warm.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.